Conservatives have been on defense for too long. The left pushes their destructive policies, and we run interference. It's time to go on offense. I'm Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. Join me for honest conversations with bold leaders championing the comeback of America. Visit kevinrobertsshow.com to subscribe.
Book that's written by our next guest. His new book is called Nation of Victims, Identity Politics, the Death of Merit, and the Path Back to Excellence. The great Vivek Ramaswamy joins us again. Vivek, great to have you here, sir.
Good to be on, man.
Talk to me about this. I think a lot of people instinctively will hear that title and know what you're talking about. Give us more detail. Nation of Victims.
Yeah, look, so I pick up where I left off at the end of my last book, Woke Inc., where Woke Inc. talked a little bit about the cynical exploitation of everyday consumers and Americans by corporations who merge their business interests by selling an agenda. But it does take two to tango. So the sequel to that book, where I ask the question of why are and a general populace falling for it? And the answer is we have a new national identity in our country. I think this is generationally driven amongst millennials, amongst Gen Z, even amongst our generation and younger, where victimhood has become our new national identity. It is the currency through which you're able to get ahead, be it in school, be it at work, be it in our culture. And the case I make in the book is that we need to fill the vacuum of identity, not with victimhood, but with the shared pursuit of excellence, which used to be what it meant to be American, to come here as an immigrant or as a first-generation American to pursue excellence and to do it unapologetically. That's the spirit we're going to have to revive in order to solve our national identity crisis. And if we don't, toxic philosophies like American victimhood fill that void instead.
It's an interesting frame. So the first book, Woke Inc., looks at the corporations, as you said, and then this book, Nation of Victims, looks at the consumers, looks at why is it that there's a market for this nonsense from the corporations. And I think, one of the I think stories I reflect on as you say that is the story of Nike when they decided to embrace a former NFL quarterback by the name of Colin Kaepernick and begin making advertising campaigns around him to sell products. And Colin Kaepernick had dived headlong into the victimhood war and had paraded himself as a victim. He's one of the most privileged people in our entire culture, and had protested the United States of America and our national anthem. Nike brings him on to do this advertising campaign. And, conservatives are probably reticent to admit this, but if you look at what that did, Nike's revenues only went up. Like Nike there was a market for Colin Kaepernick's victimhood dance. And that goes to the point you're making in this new book.
That's exactly right. And I think that, I try not to be intellectually dishonest about this when I was writing Woke Inc., where a lot of the critiques that you would hear from the right was that, well, guess what? You have an obligation to your shareholders. Well, there's so much to that claim, and we could talk for hours about it. That's why I wrote a whole book about it. I have a company, Strive, that I'm running that's focusing on shareholder power and the use of boardroom, a new voice in the boardroom as a lever. But part of the story, we can't pretend it doesn't exist, is that actually some of this stuff does cause companies to sell more product. And they do it because at the end of the day, consumers are duped into buying up the narrative of victimhood. What is it about the consumer? What is it about our national psyche that rewards this new apologist culture rather than our old culture that used to celebrate exceptionalism, the unapologetic pursuit of excellence, individual agency? That used to be part of what we thought American identity was all about. Today, it's all about apologizing for our accomplishments and even framing ourselves as victims. And in a quiet way, that's how people pursue self-interest today, is you cast yourself as a victim. That becomes a new currency that you're able to use to get ahead. And I heard you talking about the stock market earlier. Well, you think about there's a bubble. There's a cultural bubble to pair with what's going on in the stock market. The cultural bubble is that victimhood has become a currency that's trading at an all-time high. I think it will crash at some point.
Yes,
like any bubble does. But people are cashing in their chips.
It seems to me
currency trades in at a high. That's what they're doing.
As it relates to the economy, it seems to me that the only place where such decadent nonsense could thrive is a first world country. So when your primary considerations are not typically where am I going to get water, how am I going to get the power on, those types of things, you begin to have, frivolous concerns dominate some of your time. And in the United States, it's just overwhelming. It's like if I was to go to Hong Kong right now, or if I was to go anywhere in the Middle East, or if I was to go to Ukraine and raise some of the issues you and I are talking about, transgender bathrooms, on and on and on, they'd look at you like you were from a different planet. What? Can you even imagine debating those issues right now? And yet, that's where we are in America.
Absolutely, and the book was obviously published today. It was only released today, but I mean, I wrote it, months ago before, it takes that long to publish a book. But one of the things I predicted at the time I wrote it was that we're actually going to see market turbulence. You're going to see a market crash. I mean, I started predicting this even in my last book, where I had a title that was called the ESG asset bubble, or the ESG bubble. That was a chapter from Woke Inc. When I was writing this book at the early part of this year, was beginning to say, look, I think there's a lot of reasons to begin to be concerned about where the market's going to go, but that could be good for our culture. And at the end of the day, I think that there's hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. Oftentimes, hardship is what allows you to rediscover who you really are. Just a good example, even in corporate America, was take Netflix earlier this year.
Yeah.
It was only after they reported disastrous earnings, subscriber loss, revenue loss, profit loss, that then they came out and said, you know what, we're going to put excellence. The subtitle of this book is The Path Back to Excellence. Netflix puts excellence in its internal cultural document, and then tells its employees that, you know what, if you don't want to work on projects that have artistic merit that you disagree with, you can show yourself the way out. But what was the catalyst for getting there? It was a disastrous financial quarterly earnings report.
Right.
So at the end of the day, this is interesting, where you think about the opportunity that it's hard to see it this way when it's happening in real time, but the opportunity that economic hardship might create for a culture that has for 15 years been skiing on artificial snow. What do I mean by artificial snow? Money printed, falling on from on high like manna from heaven by the Federal Reserve. That has in some ways created a culture of artificial ease. And I think when that artificial snow stops printing, at the end of the day, tighter monetary policy, what does that do? It compresses market valuations. That's part of what leads to many market boom and bust cycles. The bust part of the cycle was driven by when monetary policies tightened.
Yes.
Okay, that's the descriptive economic part of it. But the externality for our culture could be very negative. It could lead to further psychological loss. It could create a new complex of victimhood. That's one direction we could go.
Right.
But I'm hopeful it provides a catalyst to also go in the other direction. To say that, you know what, we can rediscover who we really are, what we're made of. An economy that's not built on just the artificial support of printed money, but instead built on actual innovation, value creation, built from the bottom up. That's what I mean when I say hardship isn't the same thing as victimhood. I hope that our economy can be one of the places where we learn that lesson as well.
Yeah, I hope so too. So as things get tighter, especially for America's biggest corporations, many of whom have advanced some of the worst orthodoxies around these crazy leftist ideologies, the first people they hire, to your point, are the unproductive, the extra weight they have hanging around. That's the DEI people. They get rid of the clowns first because they need productive people to satisfy the bottom line, and that could redound to our benefit.
This is really an indulgence. Exactly right. It was a form of excess. It was a form of indulgence. And, look, that indulgence took a different form in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis, right? That was the Wolf of Wall Street stuff, right? That'd be going on excessive parties on yachts and going to strip clubs on Wall Street. Well, that was what it looked like in 2006 and 2007, but that too was a culture of excess, a culture of indulgence. This is a different type of indulgence. It's a form of moral indulgence.
Yes. It's
a form of moral superiority that still became an indulgence that was a product of excess. And I think that now a lot of that excess was created by having printed artificial money. I'm not pinning at all of the explanation on that. I'm just tying it to, since you opened the segment with commentary on the market, it is part of the book.
Yes.
So I thought it was, it's not all of the book, but it's part of the book. It's actually one of these opportunities where when you see the pullback, the tightening of monetary policy, you could see positive externalities for our culture.
Well,
whatever it is that gets us there.
They're deeply intertwined.
We need to get there.
They're deeply intertwined because if you look at the, any sociologist will tell you that somebody who comes from a good culture, somebody whose family has a healthy culture, two parents in the household, that dictates that's the biggest single indicator of whether or not you will succeed economically. So a healthy culture leads to economic success. And imagine the inverse is very true as well.
Absolutely. I think they're good. They go in both directions. I think in some ways, what we've created though is a culture of incumbency. Right. I think that victimhood is born out of one's status as an incumbent. And I think it is not an accident that, let's just take, I'm a first generation Indian American. Okay. One of the things I see in the Indian American community is that the second and third generation kids are now recasting their own identity, the way they see themselves through these victimhood narratives too, calling themselves persons of color to recognize that actually we're one of those guys and not the other guys.
Right.
Well, first of all, there's private advantages to accrue to that. To a better chance of getting into college, better chance of being liked in a Hollywood-like culture that elevates victims and penalizes success. But the irony is that that's actually the generation that didn't go through all the hardships that their parents and grandparents came through to come halfway around the world to a place where they didn't speak their native language.
Right.
And by the way, without even cell phones or anything to communicate with the people and families they left behind. That's the journey that my
But
parents
they want to
made.
cash in on their ancestors' hardships.
Exactly. When in fact, but the irony is they're not the ones encountering that hardship, and that's not just a coincidence. Those two go hand in hand, because once you're born as an incumbent, you then have a psychological need that you have to fill by describing yourself as a victim. And not only is it a psychological need, it's now an incentive structure that we've created in the country itself, whether it's getting into college, whether it's getting a job,
Yes.
whether it's with aggregating cultural currency or fame. Victimhood has become the way to do it. And the call I make in the book is to say we need to go back to unapologetically winning and unapologetically focused on achieving excellence, whatever that means in your chosen field.
Yes.
We need to go back to rewarding excellence over victimhood.
Okay, I want to ask you about to what extent do you address the issue of judgment? So we, in the victim culture, empathy is prized above all. Like, hey, keep your mouth shut. You be empathetic. You have to understand that you don't even understand their quote lived experience. And so as a society, it seems we've abandoned what we've cast as something negative, which is to judge something, to basically say that an undesirable behavior or an undesirable cultural action should be judged accordingly, and we should address it with some sense of shame. When you see a hospital who is sterilizing children through elective surgeries, then you should look at them and say, no, you should feel shame for that. Our culture should judge you for that. How much does judgment play a role here?
It's a great point, and we're getting even in a short conversation pretty deep to the heart of this pretty quickly. So look, one of the cases I make, it's why I no longer call myself a libertarian. I used to call myself a libertarian because I happen to support policies that a libertarian would often support. I no longer call myself a libertarian because libertarianism has nothing to say about what those free people do in that society that's free of state intervention. Okay, what do you do now? And I think that those are some of the most important questions we got to ask ourselves. That gets to a question of virtue. Okay, virtue is not a product of capitalism. It can be a byproduct of capitalism, but I think even more importantly, it is a precondition for capitalism itself. And I think that that's one of the things that the conservative movement needs to, I think, wake up to, is that yes, we care about reviving our individual identities where we can each pursue our individual dreams, our own destinies, and achieve self-actualization. And that's one vision of pursuing excellence. But that's only half the story. I think the other half of the story is also a revival of something that I make a case for the book in large part in the second half of the book, is a revival of civic duty. There's a chapter in the book entitled A Theory of Duty. It's a play on John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, which served as the North Star of much of liberalism in the latter half of the 20th century. Well, I offer what I call a theory of duty as potentially an important part of a North Star for the future of the conservative movement, to recognize that you actually have to also cultivate a sense of duty to do the right thing, to be able to say that, this is objectively the right way to live and not the right, and this objectively is not the right way to live. And we are going to exercise judgment, personal discretion in making that choice, not just in a libertine way where we have to just be free to make our choices, but that there are right choices and wrong choices. And some of those right choices involve recognizing that we have duties as citizens that allow us, once we fulfill those duties, to be more effective at being free agents in our system of free market capital.
And we should
I think both of those things matter.
We should reward that. When people answer the call of duty, they should be rewarded for it. This book is a good template for this whole conversation. In fact, that you can get way more in depth with Vivek Ramaswamy by purchasing and reading his book, Nation of Victims: Identity Politics, the Death of Merit, and the Path Back to Excellence. Vivek, congratulations again. You're an important voice in an important conversation. Thank you, sir.
For decades, Rolling Stone has set the bar for entertainment publications. Today, Rolling Stone Music Now takes over in podcast form. Wolfgang Van Halen talks about working on his new album.
I wrote a bunch of ideas during quarantine. I'll just have an idea and I'll just bring out my voice memos on my phone. Every bit of time off I've had in between touring in the past year, I started making demos. So I've just accumulated a bunch of ideas that I'm really excited to start working on.
Rolling Stone Music Now. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.